Hi, and welcome to this series of mini lectures on the 2020 US election Facebook studies. For the record, my name is Wouter van Atteveld. I'm Professor of Computational Communication Science at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. The 2020 US election Facebook studies is a group of studies done by a collaboration between a number of prominent United States scientists and the company Meta, known for Facebook and Instagram, but the studies focus mostly on Facebook. And what they try to do is to find out how Facebook and Instagram were used in the 2020 elections and what kind of effects this might have had on the election. We'll talk more about the independence of the researchers and the possible motivations for Facebook in the last video in this series, but let's first look into one of the first studies that was actually published, namely the study by Sandra González-Bailón and many others, termed Asymmetric Ideological Segregation in Exposure to Political News on Facebook. What is this study trying to do? The main research question they had, as also apparent from the title of the paper, is whether Facebook enables ideological segregation in political news consumption. What that means is that the question is whether people looking at Facebook all more or less see the same content, if it's a homogeneous content, or whether it is segregated in the sense that some people see one kind of content and other people see another kind of content. And especially in the context of American political news, the real question was, is there a segregation between more left-wing or liberal users and more right-wing or more conservative users? This is an observational study, so this is not an experiment. They used the natural behavior of people on Facebook, and this allowed them to have a very impressive 200 million users, all United States Facebook users, for which Facebook had a predicted ideology. So Facebook knew or was able to predict whether those people were mostly liberal or mostly conservative users. From this, González-Bailón and their co-authors computed two scores. One is the segregation index. The segregation index says something about the total landscape, and it is a measure of whether the total amount of news on Facebook is consumed more or less by everybody in the same way, then the segregation would be 0, or whether the liberals only conserve one type of news and conservative only consume another type of news, and there's no overlap between those two audiences, then the segregation index would be 1. Next, they compute a favorability score, which is measured at the content level. So for every piece of content, every news item, every post, they measure whether that particular post is favored mostly by a liberal audience, in which case it would have a value of -1. It is mostly valued by a conservative audience, and it would have +1 as a value, or it's in between, it would be between those extremes. And then finally what they do is they compare the potential, the exposed and the engaged audience of every post. What that means is that the potential audience of a post is every user that could have seen it because they follow one of the users, pages or groups that has posted or reposted this particular post. Next, of course, you don't always see everything you could have seen because the algorithm creates your feeds and decides what to put at the top of your feed, how to order your feed, and so effectively curates your feeds to determine what you see. And this is the exposed audience, so which posts are actually exposed to which audiences through the algorithm. And finally, as a user, you don't engage with every post that shows up on your timeline. So every post is then engaged with by an even smaller audience. That is the audience that actually clicked on or liked or shared that particular post. Now, from these measurements, they generate a number of maybe intimidating looking but quite interesting figures. So let's have a look at these figures, or at least the relevant figures, one by one. So first, subfigure A. What this shows is the overall segregation index of posts on Facebook at the domain level and at the URL level. What they mean with that is that at the domain level, it would be something like nytimes.com or breitbart.com, or also google.com or youtube.com. So that means that you see the sort of company or the platform that serves the particular content. The URL level means the URL of the actual post. So that could point to one specific news article in a news site, or it could point to one specific video on YouTube. And what you see here is that the segregation index at the URL level is higher than that at the domain level. And the blue line is above the yellow line here. But there's not an awful lot of movement here. Segregation seems to be going up a little bit towards the elections and then go down a little bit afterwards again. But it doesn't look overly significant here. It makes sense, of course, that URL level would be more segregated at the domain level. The more specific a piece of news is, the more likely it is that it is mostly consumed by certain audiences, while something like the New York Times is quite likely that some conservative users and some liberal users both occasionally use this news source. Also, of course, there are some domains like, for example, youtube.com, where the domain itself doesn't actually say anything about the contents. So you wouldn't expect YouTube to be necessarily more segregated in its audience. But of course, particular individual YouTube videos could well be segregated. Next, let's look at where the segregation comes from. So at the bottom, the yellow line here is the potential audience. So this is the segregation of what kind of posts could have been seen by people depending on who they follow, who they like. Next is the exposed audience, which is quite a bit higher than the potential audience at the domain level. And finally, we see the engaged audience, which is even higher. And again, all of these three lines seem mostly constant during the time of the study. What that means is that the segregation at the engaged level is higher than the exposed, which is higher than the potential. So at the domain level, the algorithm sort of segregates the post a little bit more, but then users decide to interact quite a bit more with specific posts depending on their own ideology. So what users determine to click on is quite a lot more segregated than what users are seeing, which is slightly more segregated than what users could have been seeing. And finally, if we look at the URL level here in subfigure C, we see that the difference between the potential audience and the exposed audience is practically gone. So what that means is that even though at the URL level the audiences are more segregated on Facebook than at the domain level, this segregation does not seem to be caused by the algorithm per se, but it's caused mostly by the decisions of users to befriend certain people or to follow certain pages or groups. And within the content that they're exposed to, also to engage with specific content, which again is more segregated. So what content people engage with is again more determined by whether they are mostly left-leaning or mostly right-leaning. Next, let's look at subfigures E and F. Again, this is at the domain level and at the URL level. And what you see here is a density plot. So that means that basically the whole plot adds up to 100%. And we see the favorability score going from the very liberal to the very conservative. What it means is that a piece of content in the middle here is seen by as many liberals as conservatives. A piece of content on the extreme left-hand side of this graph is consumed almost only by liberal audiences. And on the right-hand side, it's consumed almost by conservative audiences. So what you see here, and let's look at the exposed audience. So what people see in their timeline is that the majority of the content is here in the middle, which means that it's either not segregated at all or it's a little bit segregated towards either side. Interestingly, on the left-hand side, so at the liberal side of the spectrum, there's actually very little content that is extremely segregated. But on the right-hand side, at the conservative side, there is actually a bulge here, which means that there is a specific set of content that is consumed almost exclusively by conservative users. And again, a little bit similar to the previous, there is not a lot of difference between the potential and exposed and engaged audience in terms of this shape, although the bulge here is a little bit more pronounced in the exposed audience. At the URL level, the picture is a little bit more extreme. What you see here is that this group of content that is consumed as much by the left as by the right is a lot smaller, and the liberals also have a bit of a bulge here. That means that there's also a group of URLs, a group of particular items that are seen more mostly by liberal people. And at the right hand side of the spectrum, there's a quite pronounced peak where a big set of content is consumed almost exclusively by conservatives. And again, the general shape is the same between the potential and the exposed audience, but it's more pronounced, especially on the conservative side here, in the exposed audience, which means that it's partly caused by which people and pages people decide to follow, but it is then exaggerated a little bit by the algorithm. What is quite interesting, and this is not in the original article, but it's alluded to in the article and it's included in the supplementary material, is basically a disaggregation of the same data by user, page, and group. So for those of you who are not active Facebook users, from my understanding, a user would be the normal people that you and I befriend. So these could be your coworkers or your uncles or your family. So that they are regular people, you befriend them, they befriend you, and then they you can see what they post. Pages and groups are collectives. So a group is a group of people that post things and everyone in the group can see it, and a page is the page of an organization. It could be a newspaper, it could be a political organization, so that is not a regular person, but an organization specifically represented on Facebook. And what you see here, especially at the URL level here, it's interesting to see that the segregation from the users is not so high, but almost all of the segregation here is due to the pages and the groups. So that means that the the actual social media part of Facebook, so where you follow your friends and the friends post things and you see the post by your friends or your uncles or aunts or whatever, is not nearly as segregated as the pages and the groups that are more collective and more organizational. At the bottom half we see more or less the same picture, so especially from the users almost all the content is here in the middle, but we see still the sort of the conservative peak here is pronounced a little bit, and the content is more segregated at the domain level, at the user, at the page and the group level. And we see the same here with the URLs, but even more extreme. So the URLs posted by people, there's a little bit of mostly liberal content, but that is not consumed, say by only liberals, but it's consumed by liberals and moderates. But there's also a group of content posted by users that is mostly consumed by conservatives. At the page and the group level, we see a much more segregated image where there's a lot of content seen only by liberal people and even more content seen only by conservative people. So what we see here in basically this combination of graphs is that there is segregation. This segregation is mostly due to decisions people make in who to follow and what content to engage with. And it is mostly driven by the pages and groups that people follow. And if we look at the difference between liberals and conservatives here, we see that although there is also some segregation at the liberal end, especially where pages and groups are concerned, there is much more segregation happening on the conservative side with quite a lot of content seen only by conservative people. Then let's look at misinformation. So Facebook registers some domains as untrustworthy, which means is that they tend to post things that are less trustworthy in other pages. And they also classify specific URLs as misinformation. And the researchers here used the classification by Facebook after trying a number of their own classifications. It turned out that the classification used by Facebook was more accurate and reliable than what they did themselves. So what you see here, both at the domain level, but even more extreme at the URL level, is that misinformation seems to be practically only a conservative issue on Facebook. So what it means is that of all the information classified by Facebook as misinformation, is almost only consumed by conservatives, and that is by who they decide to follow. It's a little bit more pronounced by the algorithm, and it's done by what the users post, and again it's a little bit more pronounced in the page and groups, but it is basically exists there across the board. Then finally, the authors present one more figure, which I am okay if not everybody completely understands this figure, as it is a little bit complicated, but I figured I'd explain it anyway. So the authors were afraid that they might rely a little bit too much on the classification by Facebook into liberal and conservative viewers. So they wanted to also present an alternative analysis where they do a clustering of items based on the co-audience network. So what it basically means is that if two items are consumed by the same kind of people, then they are clustered together. If they are not consumed by the same people, then they are not clustered together. And according to the authors, the fact that in most cases you see 2 or 3 fairly big clusters means that there are apparently clusters that are seen by some people but not seen by other people. So that's also evidence of the segregation. And if they plot this again against the favorability score, you can see that there's one cluster in most time, because this goes over time, that is mostly consumed by moderate or moderate liberals. And there is a group of content, a cluster of content that is mostly consumed by mostly conservative people. What is quite interesting as well, if you look at the color, the green is mostly trustworthy information and the red is mostly untrustworthy domains. And you see here that on the conservative sides, overall, there's more untrustworthy information. But especially this started happening after the election. You see it here a little bit between the election and January 6th. Which could be caused, of course, by conspiracy theories or misinformation about the election starting to be spread after the election. It could also be that Facebook relaxed some of its moderation a little bit after the election, because they figured that with the elections over, it wasn't as important anymore. You see the same picture at the URL level, where there's actually most of the time 3 clusters, one a fairly liberal cluster, one mostly moderate cluster, and one strongly conservative cluster. And here you can also see the misinformation really starting after the elections, heading up to the January riots. So what do we conclude from this article? In my opinion, this is a very interesting observational study based on a quite rich data set of exposure data. It's not every day that we get access to 200 million records of items and of everybody who consumed those items. And so this is a really nice data set, and I think it gives quite an interesting insight also into the audience structures at Facebook. What we can conclude from there is that there is indeed segregation on Facebook. There's quite a lot of content that is mostly seen by liberals, and there's even more content that is almost only seen by conservatives. If we look at misinformation, we also see that the misinformation on Facebook, as measured again by Facebook itself, is almost completely consumed by conservative audiences. And finally, this segregation is mostly related to user decisions. So the decision of users to friend certain people, but especially also to follow certain pages and groups, and is not directly caused by the Facebook algorithm selecting some information in the feeds above other information.